the last hope-based shift. So we talked about fear to hope, about thinking of the emotions of our audiences, that these are also important for getting policies passed. We talked about the danger, which is they want people to feel that we live in a divided society, and that some of the work we've been doing is actually we need to avoid falling into the trap of being one side of a divided society and actually make people believe we're in a joint society. I know it feels really hard to do that, but as long as there is that dichotomy, then we're stuck in it. Talked about trying to achieve that shift by talking about what we're for and trying to find common values that everyone can, or the majority of the population can subscribe to. About showing how we want to actually make the change happen and focusing more on how the solutions would work. How will promoting human rights policies and putting them in place and make change happen? And then finally, there was this focus on our audience. How can we, instead of showing them a threat, can we actually give them an opportunity to be part of change, to do human rights, to enjoy human rights? Today, we're going to focus on this story of what is it we do. And these are the kind of key building blocks of a strategy of narrative change. So the last shift is about victim to hero. So on a very basic level, the word hero here is sometimes there are issues around, we don't necessarily call people heroes, but the idea is the people in our story, rather than them being passive, people whose rights are taken away, we want to actually show people as protagonists in their own story. So on a very basic level, it's on our storytelling that we don't just want to show people as, vulnerable and weak and without agency. We don't want to trigger pity. We want to trigger solidarity. So it's thinking less of that. Remember that pain response? We don't want people to say, imagine you were suffering like this person. Because our brain resists the pain response. So we don't want to think of ourselves suffering, or we make up excuses. We use our worldview to justify, to rationalize why the bad things are happening to them that wouldn't happen to us. So the trick is more, can we actually put the person who we want to support equal to our audience and say, stand with this person? And I think that's where we focus on the human more than the rights. Why this is important? So there's this concept called prototyping, where when you show a group of people, remember I showed some pictures of large swarms, quote unquote, groups of refugees and migrants that the far right use. And remember this idea of waves or swarms triggering our sort of primordial fears, making us think of natural disasters or of plagues of animals. All this kind of subconscious triggers. Basically, the human mind can't process large groups of people. So there's even research that shows when you show someone one story, they can have empathy. But as soon as there's even a second character in the story, the human mind loses that ability anymore to have compassion with the group of people. So here's how this works politically. There was this story in the 1970s in the United States of one African-American woman who was getting several welfare checks under several identities. And it's actually a much more complicated story. There's a podcast about it. But the right wing took this example and used it to say, Ronald Reagan started saying, have you heard about this welfare queen who's rich and driving fancy cars and wearing fancy clothes while getting paid on several different unemployment benefits? And what he did was saying, this is happening all over the country. We've got all these welfare queens. So he created this prototypical character in the minds of his audience that started to become common sense. This idea that if you are kind, if you're a nurturing parent, if you give people a chance, they will take advantage. So human nature is fundamentally flawed. And basically, if you have a left-wing economic policy, people will take advantage. And obviously, it was also quite racist, is touching on those tones. But in Europe, even without the race element, it's also present. There's this idea, that Angela Merkel said, people can't bail out Greece. Everyone knows that you can't spend money you don't have. And she actually said every housewife. And this is another example of these simplified metaphors about how the economy works, even though very few people own a house without actually getting a mortgage. So it's not even true, but it's this common sense idea. So this is important for us because we have a lot of challenges in our storytelling. It's very hard for us to focus on the story of one person because there's so many other stories out there. How do we tell the story, for example, of a successful migrant who's integrated in the community when there's all these other people who are suffering? We feel that duty to the suffering. So there are ways to tell several stories, but the point we need to know is this is how the human mind works. The other side are very good at making people have a prototype in their head of migrants and refugees, basically as of others, as a threat, as a criminal. And so that's why the 1 in 100 argument is so effective, right? That it just takes one outsider to be a terrorist, etc. And if we try and, just the more we say that's not true, refugees are not a threat, we're still talking about the 1 in 100. The only way to beat this is to provide a different prototype for the people we want our audience to think about. So there's a lot of different strategies for doing that. For example, one Swiss group bought YouTube ads over far-right videos. So before you could, those annoying YouTube ads that pop up before you want to watch a video. So before our poor, potential right-wing extremists could watch their hate video, they had to meet an actual refugee who would tell them their story. Another way we tried to do this at Amnesty International a few years ago was countries in Europe started, as you probably know, deporting people in large numbers back to countries like Afghanistan and Iraq. Amnesty wrote a report. We said, here's our big shocking number, more than 1,000 people deported in the last year. It got news stories, but it just didn't cut through. So the way we tried to tell the story was, here's one person called Hobe-based on the left of this story. And she has lived in Norway the last 10 years. She goes to school in Norway. She's never actually been to Afghanistan, but Norway wants to send her back. But we didn't just tell the story that way. First of all, Hobe was resisting, but we also made a story about Hobe's friend who is running a campaign to keep her. And so the story was not just about, the victim being abused by the Norwegian government. It was about friendship and solidarity. And so the key point is, if you want to change someone's mind, you need to show them someone like them also changing their mind. If you want someone to behave a certain way, you need to show them someone that they can see themselves as behaving that way. And this is called simulating behavior. And again, human beings, we follow social taboos. If we see people in our community acting a certain way, we're more likely to mimic that. And so again, this is a real challenge. We always have to expose the problem and call it out. Remember, I talked about putting things in the context of how things should be. And so our instinct is often, we spend a lot of time documenting the far right, extreme right and all the hate speech, because it's appalling. But we also need to show people how they should behave. And we need to elevate the people who are showing behavior that we want replicated. So in this case, it's the story, it's basically our characters. We have two heroes, but it's also, we're telling a story of solidarity, of how this is what solidarity looks like. Step one of the victim to hero shift is obviously letting people tell their own story as protagonists, talk about their hopes, their aspirations, showing the courage people are showing. But the other character of the story is the people who are welcoming. Actually, migration as a policy challenge isn't actually about the people who move, it's about the people who welcome or not. And the policy challenge is actually, can we make societies more welcoming? And once we do that, we could see this issue as a behavioral change issue. We need to make more people more vocal and more active in their willingness to welcome others. So it's about also trying to elevate moments such as this one, that famous and all too fleeting moment where people rush to the station. But these are strong and powerful human instincts that we can actually we can encourage. And so a communication and a narrative strategy can also be about, how do we elevate these stories that when they happen, you could say, okay, this is just one story. What about all the other bad cases? But from a narrative point of view, when something happens that we want to see more of, we need to make sure that more people talk about it, because the other side aren't going to do that for us. The media aren't going to necessarily do that for us. So part of our work also has to be elevating what do human rights look like. Pro-human rights behavior. Not just elevating those stories, but if we've identified them, we can start to make them happen. I imagine a lot of you will have seen this video, and it's a little long, so it's going to be one of those videos I share with you to watch later. But one of the most powerful and effective pieces of social media content Amnesty International ever made was this experiment where you had European, like newcomers and older Europeans have a moment of close personal contact. So we know from a lot of survey work that a lot of the fear of the other comes in communities that actually haven't met a migrant ever and are never about to. Or there's countries, Hungary is a great example of where there's this, they keep using this rhetoric of they're going to be invaded by foreigners, but most people go through Hungary to get to Germany. What we know is that positive social contact creates empathy between groups. But we can't take a really nice migrant and have them meet everyone. And also we don't want to ask migrants to have to prove their humanity to people. although that part of our strategy faced with dehumanization should be one of rehumanization. But the way we do that is, first of all, we don't want people to be portrayed as victims. We want to show them as human beings just like us. So the shift could almost be victims to humans. We want people to tell their own story, to talk about, shared hobbies, shared goals. I want to be a teacher. I support this football club. I love running. I love pets, for example. But above all, we can create moments of positive social contact and then make sure other people see them so they can actually see themselves in these shoes. So the audience for this video is the person on the right. So, when you watch this video, I guarantee you'll cry. The thing is, we reflect the emotions that we see in front of us. So we almost start to share the emotional experience of the person in front of us. The next step in narrative is, once we've actually identified these stories, we now have the tools, even if we can't get the media also increasingly they know that these kind of stories do well. So the media are more open to these kind of emotional standout moments that we can find in our everyday. But if they don't, we can also run social media ads. And I'll show you a little bit of how we do that. But we can take a profile like the person on the right in this ad video and send them targeted advertising. So we know the far right are using targeted advertising like this to spread hate. Our challenge is, how do we use targeted advertising to spread love, empathy, and support for human rights? So an example of that is, and this applies to any issue, but I think it's particularly important for migration, that we need to shift away from crisis and borders to about welcoming. So for example, Amnesty International in USA ran this campaign called A Longer Table. We don't build walls, we build a longer table. And so it's really showing, like, here are people just like you or me, welcoming others, coming together. And so what this suggests is the future of human rights protests and activism, maybe less demonstrations and more dinners. It's about, what is the society we want to see? So here's an example, like, in terms of basically borrowing from American politics, which is kind of leading the way in terms of using social media for attitude and behavioral change. Beto O'Rourke in the Senate election of 2018 tried to portray himself as a sort of different candidate. I'm closer to Texans. And the way he did that was drive all over Texas, his story was, I'm going to go to every single part of Texas and meet people. And what he did was, he filmed it all on his smartphone, and every day he uploaded it. So where we're seeing just Beto, what we need to do is think of, what are the kind of stories we need to see? So for example, migrants helping people out during COVID. And the point is, once we know what we want these stories to be, and obviously we can experiment and test it, and we can run focus groups, we can start putting up the various stories. And remember, these are examples of strategies. The story could be anything. It can also just be a series of reports, be a series of meetings. The point is that we don't need like massive PR budgets or big ad firms. The more authentic the story, the better. So this is really about us and our partners and our stakeholders, what they film on their smartphone. We can tell our partners and allies, actually, we need you to tell more stories of welcome, for example. When you do, take out your smartphone and film it. But it's just an example of how, to me, the future of narrative change, communications, and activism, and I'll also say what this means in general for human rights, it's about small, authentic, everyday stories. So I spoke earlier about a mosaic. We build up a narrative through every day adding different tiles, different stories to the mosaic. And the goal is what we call salience. Elevating. Can we get more people to talk about stories? And at first, we're never going to get the same amount of people to see our story as public television owned by a hostile government or, sensationalist right-wing media. But we have to start creating the alternative. And there is an increasing alternative media ecosystem. And that's where also it's important we work together to tell each other stories. So Poland, for example, there's a great campaign called, I can never pronounce properly, Tojialo, I think. It works. And so basically the campaign is basically called Civil Society It Works, and they have a wonderful Instagram feed and across all social media channels, they just tell the stories of local civil society groups helping out in the community. And this is step one to narrative. Like I said, remember, if we don't tell our story, no one else will. And once we start telling our story a certain way, we will start to find allies who share our values with more cultural power than us. Artists, YouTube influencers, young people. But they have to get the cue from us. We have to give them a simple message of what we stand for. And this is a key point. There's a crucial difference between mobilizing and organizing. So in mobilizing, we give people a petition and say, sign our petition. In organizing, we ask people to join our cause and let them use their own creativity to express our values in different ways. And so this is why our first step with narrative is we have to tell people what we stand for first. And so once we start doing that, we can start to explore tools. So for the example, running Facebook ads to test messages, but also to reach people directly. So the key one, for example, I feel a bit sad showing this now, but Elizabeth Warren, who in my opinion should be president, her whole narrative and message was, I don't take big donations. I'm funded by, I want $3 from every ordinary people there who funds me. And then she would call them up on her phone and just say, hey, thanks for your donation. And obviously the person would be amazed and start crying and so emotional, but she would then take that video and run it as an ad. So you can imagine yourself getting the call from Elizabeth Warren. It's just an example of the kind of advertising we can do. So for example, what we could do with that is, this is a survey that shows like what makes you more likely to accept immigration. And the key first thing that comes top of the list is people being able to speak the language. So that's an example of an insight we could take and say, okay, let's tell stories of people from different countries who now speak Italian, say. And that is something we integrate into our storytelling. This is, you don't need to read the details of this, but so an example of how we've been taking this work forward, there's some work I've done with the UN where we said, who are the people most likely to share positive stories about migration today? We can target people who have a similar profile with others with the same kind of story so that they also then start sharing those stories. So essentially what this is, it's about mobilizing people who share our values to start telling our stories, and that helps us change the narrative. So basically, who are these silent majority of people who wish we could help other people, who want more diversity in society, who want to welcome? How do we make them more vocal? And then what we can also do is start testing what are the stories that cut through emotionally. So and you don't necessarily need to think, okay, am I going to be able to do this tomorrow? It's more so what tools are available to us once we've identified them. But there's this great tool that measures the emotional response to stories on social media. So I was tracking during COVID, what were positive COVID stories that really moved people, that we need to shift the media away from those crisis sort of negative stories. The media also are looking for these stories that they know people will relate to emotion. And so there was this story, I don't actually think it's that great a story, but over and over again, it was resonating with people that Irish people were crowdfunding a tribe in the USA who had supported them during the famine. And it touches on these themes of reciprocity and support and care. But all these other groups, like the story originated one place, and all newspapers these days are monitoring what triggers these emotions on social media. So basically, if we find stories that do resonate emotionally, and the key thing to think about here is admiration and generosity. So we need to start thinking of these positive values, these positive emotional triggers for our values and for human rights. Then we can start identifying stories that trigger those. But this triggered lots of admiration and generosity and made people feel good. And so the New York Times saw this story performing well. They wrote a story about it. And I can guarantee you they wrote the story just because they knew it would get clicks. But again, we know that all the fake news stuff, I don't need to tell you about how that's being driven by clicks. So part of our work has to be, how do we trigger those more positive sort of, underlying emotional values? The point is that we can compete with the sort of things happening on the other side without playing their game. We don't have to fight hate and anger with hate and anger. We can, rather than fight fire with fire, this is the water that we can use to douse those fires. Even this is a slide that I've been using for 2 or 3 months. Just yesterday, another version of this story, the same story posted from another Facebook feed, popped up as the most strongly performing positive emotional post on Facebook yesterday. That's just to show like an example of how we can start to get our stories across. The key point is, if we can identify our target audience, then we can start to get that audience to speak to it directly. So this is just an example of from development, but in the UK, the development umbrella group, instead of showing people ads of starving children, will show a group in a certain part of the UK, one person from the UK who's organizing charity work. And they're literally just run an ad, say, yeah, I think it's important, we care. People forget how much of a difference we can make. And they did A/B tests. So they ran this ad to the same audience as a traditional, poverty ad. this was more effective. One message there is about, we can actually use the audience we have, but also testing. It's so important that we just try different things out. But remember that message from last week, it's not about saying what's popular. So we're not just trying to get clicks, it's about making popular what needs to be said. So we start with, as we've been working on, these messages, these ideas we want to get across, and then we experiment with what's the story that will actually trigger that for people. And again, I'm showing you examples that are just everyday, a bit more political campaigning, but this can apply to your work as well. Based on this work, as a report I wrote with a colleague called Krisna, we did workshops with human rights groups around the world asking, how do we counter populist narratives? And we went through a little bit the process we've been going through together. But we asked above all, like, what is so damaging about populism? Like, what is the root thing that makes us so uncomfortable about it? And then we also looked at, above all, it was that division of society. And we realized what we want more of is community, togetherness, people to care for each other, people to work together. And then we realized actually human rights groups need to work directly towards the things we want in society, not just calling out the things we're against, but if we want more empathy in society, then we need to actually undertake actions that will bring about directly more empathy. The crucial thing that we learned in working with human rights groups was it's not just the words you use that make narrative. So we could state that civil society works with the people every day, but if our action is to hold a press conference in the capital city, the thing we've done, the story of that day, is still a narrative that suggests elitism, right? We're just a small advocacy group. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't do that anymore, but you also have to think of the picture, the story about what you've done. So that's why we have this messages of what you do is the narrative. It's not just what you say, but the story you tell. What's the picture people will see when they come to your Facebook feed? If it's a picture of protesters fighting the police, that's still a narrative of division, and that triggers all sorts of subconscious ideas. So what we're going to work on today is thinking visually, these values we've been talking about, human rights cares for you, human rights protects you. What's a story that actually brings that narrative to life? So the challenge is basically, and this actually comes from something Barack Obama said when he was developing his message, change we can believe in. It's not about coming up with a slogan. What you do is the campaign.